The chip behind my ear buzzed with 11 languages at once, and I had less than a minute to make humanity sound like a species worth fearing. I stood at the podium of the Galactic Council chamber, both hands flat on the cold rail, and read the final line of Earth's warning into the silence. Stand down the blockade around our system, or face the consequences we have already prepared. Nobody answered right away. Then the laughing started. It came delegation by delegation, like a wave finding new rooms to fill. The Veltaran ambassador laughed through 3 throats at once, a sound like gravel dragged across metal. The Drenic cluster clicked their mandibles together in a rhythm I had learned meant amusement. Even the quiet ones, the species who never showed reaction to anything, tilted their heads toward each other in something close to delight. I kept my hands on the rail. I did not move them. The council speaker, a tall gray being named Senar Eve, raised one hand, and the chamber settled, though the amusement did not leave the room. It only went quiet, the way a held breath stays full even when nobody is speaking. Translator, Senar Eve said, her voice carrying through every headset without effort. You may inform your government that the council finds Earth's position noted and unconvincing. The warning stands, I said. 43 days. 43 days, she repeated, and something in the way she said it made the chamber laugh again, softer this time, almost fond, the way adults laugh at a child who has just announced he plans to fight the sun. A delegate I did not recognize, broad-shouldered, plated in something like dark bone, leaned toward the Veltharan ambassador and said, not quietly enough, do they truly believe 3 ships and a speech change anything? The Veltharan ambassador, whose name was Threl Vassarin, did not bother to lower his voice either. They believe what loud, frightened species always believe. That noise is the same thing as strength. Near the back of the chamber, one delegate did not laugh. He sat very still, plated arms folded, watching me instead of the spectacle around him. I knew his face from a dozen prior sessions. Kael Dorum, of a smaller cluster that had never voted against Earth, though he had never voted strongly for us either. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply watched, the way a person watches weather they are not yet sure how to read. I did not answer Threl Vassarin. My orders were clear. Deliver the warning. Hold the line. Leave no opening for negotiation, because there was no negotiation left to have. 3 years of trade restrictions had become 18 months of armed escort blockades, and 18 months of blockades had become a starvation timeline our analysts had run 100 different ways, and every version of that math ended in the same place. Earth could not feed itself past those 43 days, not with the corridors closed the way the council had closed them. I had asked, before I left, why we were bothering with a warning at all, if nothing about our position would change anyone's vote. My superior, a tired man named Ian Brackett who ran what used to be called Foreign Affairs and was now something closer to a war office, had looked at me for a long moment before answering. Because afterward, he said, the record will show we told them first. I had not understood the weight of that sentence until I stood in the chamber, watching beings from 11 worlds laugh at the exact words I had been told to deliver. Now I understood it as something closer to a door being marked, quietly, before someone walked through it. Senar Eve lowered her hand again, and the laughter folded itself back into murmurs, business resuming as if nothing had interrupted it. That was the worst part, somehow, not the laughing, the speed at which they moved on from it. The Council's position on the Sol blockade remains as stated in the prior session, she said. Trade access will be reconsidered once Earth demonstrates compliance with shipping lane regulations. This session is concluded. I stayed at the podium a moment longer than protocol required, long enough to watch the chamber empty, delegates drifting off in clusters of 2 and 3, already discussing other matters, other species, other small fires on the edge of their attention. Nobody looked back at me. I had expected anger, maybe, or at least curiosity. What I got instead was the particular silence of people who had already decided a thing did not matter. Threl Vassarin passed close enough on his way out that I caught the last thing he said to the delegate beside him, in a language he did not know I understood well enough to catch without the chip. The loud species will quiet down once their stomachs do the talking instead of their mouths. I did not respond to that either. I had nothing in my orders that covered responding to cruelty delivered as a passing remark. I only had the number, 43, sitting behind my eyes like a coal that would not cool. Kael Dorum was the last delegate to leave. As he passed, he slowed, just slightly, just enough that I understood it was meant for me and not for the room. He said nothing. He only met my eyes for the length of 2 breaths, then continued on, plated boots echoing against the chamber floor until the great doors closed behind him. I did not know what to make of that look. I would not understand it for months. The shuttle ride back to the diplomatic transport took 11 minutes, and I spent every one of them looking out the viewport at the council spire shrinking behind us. A structure built from the combined architecture of 11 different worlds, each contributing some piece of itself to a building meant to represent unity. From a distance it looked almost beautiful, all that different stone and metal woven into one shape. Up close, I had learned, it was 11 separate buildings that happened to share a wall. My escort on the shuttle was a woman named Laura Bennett, our senior negotiator, the person whose job it had been for 3 years to find the softer path through every council session, the path that did not end in what I now understood was coming. She had not spoken since we left the chamber. She watched the same shrinking spire I did, her jaw set in a line I recognized from photographs of her father, a man who had spent his whole career trying to keep 2 countries from a war neither of them survived intact. "You did everything right in there, Caleb," she said finally. "It didn't matter," I said. They laughed. "I know." She did not look away from the window. "That was the point of sending you, instead of me. They needed to laugh at someone they didn't respect enough to take seriously. If I'd delivered that line myself, they might have wondered why we sent our best negotiator to read out a death threat. Sending a translator told them exactly what they wanted to hear, that we still think words are the only weapon we have." I turned to look at her properly for the first time since the chamber. "Do we have another one?" She was quiet long enough that I thought she would not answer. When she finally did, her voice had dropped to something just above a whisper, the kind of voice people use for things they are not yet permitted to say at full volume. "There is a program," she said. "I am not cleared to tell you what it is called. I am cleared to tell you that you'll be briefed within the week, and that after today, I think you've earned a place in that briefing." I did not ask anything further. I had spent 3 years learning that the most important sentences in this job were the ones delivered just below a whisper, in shuttles and hallways and the spaces between official sessions, and that pressing for more, before someone was ready to give it, only taught people to say less the next time. So I watched the spire disappear behind the curve of the planet instead, and I held on to the number, 43, and underneath it, quieter, a second number I had not said out loud to anyone. The number of years humanity had spent being polite to people who had already decided, long before today, exactly how much our politeness was worth. It was not very much. I understood that now. In a way I had not fully let myself understand it before walking into that chamber. Understanding it did not feel like anger. It felt like the floor of a building finally settling onto its foundation, something that had been tilted slightly out of true for years, abruptly finding level ground beneath it. By the time the shuttle docked at the transport, I had stopped watching the window. I was thinking instead about Brackett's sentence, the one about the record showing we told them first, and wondering, with a feeling I did not yet have a name for, exactly what kind of record was being prepared to come after it. I did not sleep on the journey home. I sat in the dark of my cabin and counted the number down in my head, 43 becoming 42, before the transport ever reached the edge of the Soul Corridor, and somewhere past that line, past the blockade ships that did not bother hailing us because they had already decided we were no threat worth the fuel, I understood that whatever Laura Bennett was not yet cleared to tell me, I would be part of it whether I was ready or not. The council had laughed at our warning. I did not know yet what we had built while they were laughing. I only knew, watching Earth grow larger in the viewport, blue and small and entirely unprotected by anyone but itself, that the laughing was going to stop. Brackett met me at the landing platform himself, which he had never done before, not once in 3 years of sessions that ended in smaller failures than this one. He did not ask how the chamber had gone. He had already watched the recording twice, he told me, standing with his coat pulled tight against the wind coming off the runway, and he did not need to hear it from me a third time. "You held the line," he said. "That is all I asked of you." They didn't believe a word of it. They don't need to believe it yet. He looked past me, toward the dark line of the horizon, where the sun had already gone down hours ago on this side of the planet. "Get some rest, Caleb. Real rest, not the kind you pretend to take. Someone will come for you in 3 days. After that, you won't get much more of it for a while." I asked him what that meant. He only shook his head, the way a man shakes his head at a question he has already decided not to answer twice, and walked back toward the building without another word. I stood on the platform a long while after he left, the wind pulling at my coat, the number still sitting behind my eyes, counting itself down whether I wanted it to or not. 43 days until the Council's blockade closed the gap between what Earth had and what Earth needed. I did not know it yet, standing there, but the Council had already lost something far more valuable than 3 more days of comfortable laughter. They had lost the version of humanity that still believed words were the only weapon we had. That version of me did not survive the week. A hand shook me awake at 3 in the morning, and before my eyes had even opened, someone had already pressed a travel bag into my chest and told me I had 4 minutes to dress. I did not argue. 3 days of waiting had taught me that whatever was coming would not wait for questions. I pulled on the clothes laid out for me, plain and unmarked, nothing that showed rank or department, and followed 2 silent escorts down a stairwell I had never been told existed in a building I had worked in for 3 years. We did not take the usual transport. We took an unmarked vehicle through streets with no lights, driven by someone who never once looked back at me in the mirror, and after 40 minutes of empty roads and closed checkpoints, we arrived at a hangar so far from any listed military installation that I understood, without anyone telling me, that I had just left the part of Earth's defense that showed up in any official record. Inside, the hangar held 3 ships. I had seen warships before, in briefings and in the careful photographs the Council allowed us to keep on file, the kind of vessels Earth was permitted to build under treaty limits that capped our hulls, our weapons, our drive systems, all of it measured and signed and inspected twice a year by Council observers, who never once asked what we were doing in the deep dark beyond the inspection routes. These 3 ships did not match any treaty file I had ever seen. They were built wrong, by Council standards, in a way that made my eyes want to slide off them and look somewhere else instead. Their hulls held no running lights, no reflective plating, nothing that would catch a scanner sweep unless the scanner already knew exactly where to look. They sat low and black and silent, more like absences in the hangar than objects inside it, and the few crew members moving around their hulls worked with the kind of quiet, practiced economy of people who had been doing this work in secret for a very long time. A man met me at the base of the nearest ship's ramp, broad through the shoulders, gray at the temples, wearing a uniform with no insignia I recognized. He introduced himself as Owen Pierce, Fleet Commander, and told me I had exactly 1 hour to decide whether I wanted to be part of what came next, because after that hour, there would be no clean way to walk back out of this hangar and forget what I had seen inside it. "What is this?" I asked him. "The Void Fleet," he said, like the words cost him something to say out loud. "Even here, even now. Built in the dark, outside every lane the Council ever bothered to watch. 3 years of work, nobody outside this hangar was cleared to know about. You are looking at the only honest answer Earth has ever given the Council. We just never sent it." I asked him why he wanted a translator on a warship. "Because every fight ends in a room with a podium," he said, "and next time we walk into that chamber, I want someone standing at it who has flown with the people doing the fighting." Words land different when the person saying them has bled for what they mean. I did not answer right away. I thought of the chamber, the laughter, Threll Vassarin's voice saying the loud species would quiet down once their stomachs did the talking instead of their mouths. I thought of the floor settling onto its foundation, the tilt I had felt finally finding level ground. I said yes before I had finished thinking it through, which was, Pierce told me later, exactly the answer he had been hoping for. The next 11 days blurred together into a rhythm I had never lived inside before, training that started before sunrise and ended somewhere past midnight. Every hour folded around the single fact that the countdown from the Council chamber had not stopped just because I had changed buildings. 43 had become 32, and 32 would keep falling whether or not the Void Fleet was ready to fly. I met the engineer who had built the ships before I met most of the crew who flew them. Her name was Henry Voss, despite the name sounding like it belonged to a man, and she corrected exactly one person on that point in front of me before deciding I was not worth the energy of correcting twice. She walked me through the hangar floor with the kind of pride that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. "Council treaties measure hull mass, weapon yield, drive output," she said, running one hand along a section of dark plating that seemed to drink the hangar lights rather than reflect them. "They never thought to measure what we could do with materials that don't register as materials at all. Half this hull is built from a compound that doesn't show up on any sensor suite in Council service, because no Council shipyard has ever had a reason to look for something that absorbs a scan instead of bouncing one back." "That's not a weapon," I said. "No," she agreed. "It's better than one. A weapon they can prepare for, a ship that isn't there until it already has its hands around your throat, that they can't prepare for at all." I met the pilots next, 24 of them sharing a mess hall meal that felt less like a briefing and more like a family dinner stretched too thin across too many years of secrecy. A woman named Grace Whitfield sat across from me with her boots up on an empty chair, eating with the kind of total focus people usually reserve for something more dangerous than food, and when she noticed me watching her, she grinned without an ounce of apology in it. "You're the diplomat," she said. "The one who got laughed at on the recording. That's me. I watched it 4 times. Not." She pointed her fork at me like a small friendly weapon. Best part was you didn't flinch. Pierce showed it to the whole hangar like a recruiting video. Half the new pilots signed their final commitment papers that same night. I didn't realize I was good for recruitment. Nothing recruits better than watching someone laugh at us and knowing exactly what's coming for them. She went back to her food, still grinning, and added without looking up, "Don't worry, diplomat. We'll make sure they get the joke eventually." Just from the other side of it, I learned the rest of the crew in pieces over the following days. Megan Clark ran intelligence out of a windowless room that never seemed to sleep any more than she did, tracking Council fleet movements through channels she would not explain to me even after I asked twice. Adam Foley, barely past 20, ran weapons systems on Grace's ship and treated every drill like it was the only thing standing between him and failing everyone he had ever met, an intensity that made the older crew both proud of him and quietly worried for him in equal measure. Pierce ran us through simulations that left half the new arrivals shaking by the end of the first week. Scenarios built from real Council fleet doctrine that Clark's people had been collecting for years, patient and invisible, while the Council assumed nobody outside their own borders could even read their tactical manuals. We trained for ambush, we trained for silence, we trained, more than anything, for the particular discipline required to hold a weapon ready and not fire it until the exact right moment, because the entire design of the Void Fleet depended on one single advantage the Council could never plan around. They did not know we existed. The moment we fired the first shot, that advantage started to burn down like a fuse, and every plan Pierce built treated that fuse as something precious, not to be wasted on anything less than the target that mattered most. On the 6th night, Pierce ran the entire fleet through a drift drill meant to test the absorption hulls against a live sensor sweep, borrowed equipment Clark's people had pulled from a decommissioned Council relay station nobody would miss for at least a year. Grace flew lead. I sat behind her in the observation seat because Pierce wanted a translator's ear listening for anything in the test feed that sounded like Council chatter picking up on us, a job that mostly meant sitting very still and trying not to throw up as her ship dropped into a drift pattern that felt less like flying and more like falling with extra steps. The relay swept twice, found nothing, swept a third time, slower, the kind of careful pass that meant whoever was watching the readout on the other end suspected something without being able to name it. "Hold," Pierce said over the comm, his voice flat and even, the voice of a man who had run this exact scenario in his head 100 times before ever letting it happen for real. Nobody breathes loud. Grace's hand stayed steady on the controls, though I could see the muscle in her jaw working, the only sign she gave that the silence cost her anything. Adam's voice came through from the second ship, tight and clipped, reporting weapon systems fully dark, nothing live, nothing for the sweep to catch even if the hull failed. The third sweep passed without finding us. Whoever ran that relay logged it as empty space and moved on, the same way Council instruments had logged this entire fleet as empty space for 3 straight years. When Grace finally let her hands drop from the controls, she let out a breath I hadn't realized she'd been holding the whole time alongside me. "Every single time," she said, not quite to me, not quite to herself. "Every single time I think this is the run where it doesn't work." "Has it ever not worked?" I asked. "No." She unclipped her harness, rolling her shoulders like she was shaking something loose. "Doesn't mean I get to stop being scared at will. Scared is what keeps me careful. The day I stop being scared of that sweep is the day I get all of us killed." I did not have an answer for that, so I did not offer one. I had learned, in 11 days inside this hangar, that the people who flew these ships did not need comfort from me. They needed someone who understood what the silence cost them, and who would carry that understanding into whatever room came next. On the 9th night, Grace found me on the hangar's upper platform, looking down at the 3 black ships resting below like something asleep rather than something built. She did not say anything for a while. She just stood beside me, arms folded over the rail, watching the same ships I was watching. "You scared?" she asked eventually. "Yes." "Good, means you're paying attention." She knocked her shoulder against mine, light, almost careless. "I grew up on a station that the Council let go dark for 11 days during a supply dispute. Back before any of this. I was 7. I remember exactly what it sounds like when adults stop pretending everything is fine in front of the kids. I promised myself a long time ago that the next time someone tried that on people I cared about, I'd be the reason it didn't work. She did not say anything else about it. She did not need to. I understood, standing there, that everyone in this hangar carried some version of that same promise, folded small and private, the kind of thing rule discipline never asked you to explain out loud, only to bring with you when it mattered. On the 11th night, Pierce called the full crew into the main hangar bay, all 3 ship crews together for the first time since I had arrived, and the easy noise of the mess hall dinners fell away into something quieter, more focused. The particular silence of people about to be told why all of this training had a deadline attached to it after all. Council Enforcement Squadron 79 is scheduled to intercept a human supply convoy in 4 days, Pierce said. No preamble, no softening. Standard pattern. They board, they confiscate, they make an example. Same as they've done to a dozen client species before us. Because it has always worked before. They have no reason to expect anything different this time. He let that sit a moment before continuing. That convoy is not going to be what they expect. Grace, beside me, went very still, the careless ease gone out of her posture entirely, replaced by something sharper and more focused. Adam Foley's hands had stopped moving on the tablet he had been holding. Even Henry Voss, who had spent 3 years building ships for exactly this moment, looked, for the first time since I had met her, genuinely afraid. We have spent 3 years staying invisible, Pierce said. In 4 days, that ends. I want every one of you to understand what that means before we fly. This is not a drill anymore. This is the first door we kick in, and I cannot promise any of us walks back through it the same person who walked in. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. I thought of the chamber, the laughter, the number that had started this whole countdown, falling now towards something I had not let myself fully picture until this exact moment. Standing in a hangar full of people who had spent 3 years building the answer nobody at that podium had been willing to imagine. 43 days had become 4. The laughing was almost over. 4 days passed in the kind of silence that feels louder than noise, and then the comm in my bunk lit up at 2 in the morning with a single line of text. Convoy contact in 6 hours. Report to the flight deck. I was dressed before I had finished reading it twice. The convoy was 3 cargo haulers, slow and battered on purpose, loaded with crates that looked like grain shipments and were, in fact, mostly empty. Weighted down with scrap to match the mass signature the council scanners expected. A captain named Noah Sinclair commanded the lead hauler, a quiet man with steady hands who had spent 11 years running real grain routes before anyone asked him to run a fake one as bait for an ambush he had personally requested to be part of. My brother died on a station the council let go dark, he told me, over a comm channel an hour before launch, his voice carrying no anger in it at all, only a kind of settled resolve that frightened me more than anger would have. I want to be in the room when they learn that doesn't happen anymore. Pierce's plan was simple in shape and brutal in execution. The convoy would travel its expected route, slow and visible, exactly as Council Enforcement Squadron 79 anticipated. The Void Fleet's 3 ships would drift 2 hours behind, dark and silent, holding position just outside the range where any Council sensor sweep would think to look, because no Council sensor sweep had ever needed to look there before. When the squadron moved to board the convoy, the Void Fleet would close the distance in absolute silence, weapons cold, engines dark, and would not announce themselves until they were already close enough that running was no longer an option the squadron could choose. I sat in the observation seat behind Grace again, same ship, same harness, though nothing about this felt like the drift drill from 5 nights earlier. Adam Foley ran weapons 2 seats over, his hands steady now in a way they had not been steady during the simulations, the particular calm of someone who has decided, fully and completely, that this is the moment he has been training toward. "You good back there, diplomat?" Grace asked, not turning around, her eyes fixed on the long, dark scroll of empty space ahead of us. "No," I said honestly. "Good. Means you're paying attention." We held position for 2 hours that felt like 10, watching Sinclair's convoy crawl across the display in slow, deliberate motion, bait moving exactly the way bait was supposed to move. Then Clark's voice came through the comm, flat and clipped, the voice she used when the thing she was reporting mattered more than her tone let on. "Squadron 79 has altered course. They're moving to intercept." "How many ships?" Pierce asked. 6. Lead vessel reads as enforcement class. Command signature matches a commander named Osrin Kett, 5 escort cruisers behind him. I had heard the name Osrin Kett before, in passing, in briefing notes about council enforcement actions against smaller client species. A commander known for moving fast and showing no patience for negotiation once a boarding order had been issued. He had made an example of at least 3 other species before Earth, each time with the council's full approval, each time treated as routine business in a chamber that never once questioned the method. Today, the method was about to meet something it had never faced before. The squadron closed on Sinclair's convoy with the easy confidence of a predator that had never once failed to make this exact kill. Their lead vessel hailed the lead hauler, the message relayed to all our ships so we could hear it too. A voice flat with the particular boredom of someone performing a task they had performed 100 times before. "Cargo vessel, you are in violation of trade compliance. Power down your drive and prepare to be boarded. Resistance will be treated as hostile action. Sinclair's voice came back, perfectly calm. Understood. Powering down. His hauler's drive went dark, exactly as the script demanded, and the squadron's escort cruisers began closing the final distance, weapons still holstered, because why would they need weapons ready for a target that had already surrendered? Now, Pierce said. One word, carrying every ounce of 3 years of patience behind it. Our 3 ships came out of the dark. There was no warning shot. There was no announcement, no demand, nothing that gave the squadron a single second to understand what was happening before it was already happening to them. Grace's hands moved across the controls in a pattern I had watched her rehearse a dozen times in simulation, and our ship dropped out of its drift directly behind the nearest escort cruiser, close enough that its hull filled the entire forward display. Adam fired first. A single, precise strike aimed at the cruiser's drive section, not its crew compartment, the exact targeting Pierce had drilled into every weapons officer in the fleet. Disable, don't destroy, unless destroying becomes the only option left. The cruiser's drive flared and died, the ship going dead in space, its crew very much alive, and very much unable to do anything about what had just happened to them. The second and third ships of our fleet struck 2 more cruisers in the same heartbeat, the same precise, surgical strikes. 3 council vessels disabled before Osrin Kett's lead ship had even finished processing what its sensors were telling it. Unknown contacts. A voice crackled across the open channel, sharp now, all boredom gone from it. Identify yourselves. Nobody answered him. Pierce had drilled that into us too. Silence is a weapon. Let them wonder. The remaining 3 cruisers broke formation, scrambling for a fight none of them had trained for. Weapons finally coming online. And the calm precision of the first strike gave way to something faster and messier. Ships twisting through the dark in patterns too quick for me to follow from the observation seat. The whole engagement compressed into a handful of minutes that felt like they lasted an hour. Grace's ship took a hit across its rear shielding, the whole hull shuddering hard enough that I bit down on my own tongue, the taste of copper sharp and sudden. Adam's voice came through tight, reporting shield integrity at 60% and falling, and Grace's hands never once left the controls, weaving us through a gap between 2 of the remaining cruisers with a precision that looked less like piloting and more like something closer to instinct burned into muscle over years of practice. Osrin Kett's ship is breaking off, Clark reported. He's trying to run. Cut him off, Pierce ordered. Sinclair's convoy stays protected. That is the only priority that does not move. Grace banked hard, our ship cutting across the open space between Kett's fleeing vessel and the open corridor he was aiming for. And for one moment, one single suspended moment, I watched through the forward display as his ship's weapons came fully online, aimed not at us but at Sinclair's defenseless hauler. A final act from a commander who understood he was losing, and had decided that losing did not mean leaving without taking something with him. He's targeting the convoy, I said, my voice coming out smaller than I wanted it to. Grace did not hesitate. She put our ship directly into the path of Kett's weapons fire, the only vessel close enough to make that interception in time, and the strike that should have torn through Sinclair's unshielded hauler instead tore through our rear hull section, in a flash of white light, and a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. A groaning, tearing sound that did not belong to any language I had ever learned to translate. The ship spun. Alarms filled every channel at once. Adam's voice screamed something I could not make out over the noise, and Grace's hands stayed on the controls even as the display in front of her flickered and died, fighting a ship that was no longer fully answering her, steering us away from Sinclair's convoy and away from the rest of the engagement with the last functioning thread of our drive system. We came to rest, dead and drifting, in the empty space beyond the battle. I do not remember unclipping my harness. I remember crawling forward, the smell of burned wiring sharp in my throat, and finding Grace still in her seat, very still, her hands resting loose against the controls she had refused to let go of until the very last second the ship gave her any control to hold. Adam was already there, his hands pressed against her side, his voice cracking through words that did not sound like words anymore. Just sound, just the raw shape of someone refusing to accept what his own eyes were telling him. I do not have the words to describe what came next. Not in any language the chip behind my ear had ever translated for me. I only know that I sat on that broken floor and held Grace Whitfield's hand while the rest of the battle finished without us, the remaining council cruisers either disabled or fleeing, Osrin Kett's own ship crippled and captured rather than destroyed, because even in the wreckage of everything, Pierce's order had held, disable, don't destroy, unless destroying becomes the only option left. It had not become the only option for Kett. It had become the only option for the 7-year-old girl on a dark station who had grown up to promise herself that the next time someone tried that on people she loved, she would be the reason it didn't work. She had been right about that promise. She had simply never said the cost out loud, not once, not even to me, on a hangar platform 9 nights before a battle that would carry her name into a record nobody at the council had ever bothered preparing a place for. Pierce came to find me on the second day of the return journey, his face set in the particular flatness of a man delivering an order he did not enjoy giving. Osrin Ket, captured and contained in the recovery ship's lower hold, had asked to speak with someone from the Earth delegation. Pierce wanted me in that room, not because I was the highest-ranking officer aboard, but because I was the only one who could translate the commander's words exactly, without softening them into something more comfortable. The hold was cold and narrow, lit by a single strip along the ceiling, and Osrin Ket sat against the far wall with his arms bound, his plated face unreadable to me in a way that human expressions never were. He looked up when I entered, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all, studying me the way a man studies an insect he had not expected to find indoors. "You are the translator," he said finally, his voice flat through the chip's processing, stripped of whatever texture his own language carried. "From the chamber, the one who delivered the warning we laughed at." "I am. Where did this come from?" He gestured, as much as his restraints allowed, toward the walls of the ship around him. 3 years of inspections. Twice a year my own people walked your shipyards and certified them clean. Tell me how a species we measured and cataloged built this in the space we were watching." "You weren't watching the space that mattered," I said. "You were watching the space you expected us to use. We built somewhere else." He absorbed that in silence, and something shifted behind his eyes that I recognized even across the gap between our two species. A calculation rearranging itself, old certainties failing to hold their shape under new weight. "The Council will not accept this quietly," he said. "An enforcement squadron destroyed. They will call it an act of war." "You called boarding our supply convoys routine business for 18 months, I said. "Tell me which act of war you'd prefer we use as the starting point." He did not answer that. He looked instead at the floor between his bound hands, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its flatness, something almost like genuine uncertainty bleeding through the chip's translation. "I have done this work for 11 years, he said. "Boarded a dozen species who could not stop me. I was very good at convincing myself it was simply how the galaxy functioned. The strong set the terms, the smaller species accept them, because the alternative has always been worse for them than compliance. And now? Now I do not know what the alternative looks like anymore," he said. "Because you did not behave like a smaller species today. You behaved like something that had simply chosen, for 3 years, not to show us what it was." I carried that sentence back to Pierce when I left the hold, and Pierce said nothing for a long while after I repeated it, only nodded once, slow, like a man filing away a piece of intelligence more valuable than anything Clark's screens had pulled from a dozen council channels. "That's the part they'll struggle with," Pierce said eventually. "Not the loss. Loss they understand. What they won't understand is that we could have shown them this years ago and chose silence instead. That tells them something about us they can't fight with ships." Sinclair's convoy reached its destination intact. Every crate, every crew member, every life that Osrin Ket had been so certain he could take without consequence, walked away from that engagement alive, and the cost of that was written in a silence that filled our recovery ship the entire 2 days it took to limp back toward Earth. Pierce did not speak much during those 2 days either. I caught him once, alone in the observation deck, looking out at the stars with an expression I had not seen on him before. Something that looked almost like grief wearing the shape of a man who had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this outcome, and had still not been ready for it when it finally arrived. "She knew the risk," he said, when he noticed me standing there. "They all do. That doesn't make it easier to watch." "Did it work?" I asked. "Was it worth it?" He turned back to the stars before answering, his voice quiet in a way command voices were never supposed to sound. "Ask the Council," he said. "I imagine they're about to have a very different opinion of us than they did a week ago." He was right. Within a day of our return, Clark's intelligence feeds lit up with chatter from a dozen different council channels, all of it circling the same impossible report. An enforcement squadron destroyed, disabled, and captured by an unknown force operating from inside the Sol system, a system the Council's own treaty inspections had certified, twice a year for 3 years running, as holding nothing beyond the approved and the harmless. They had laughed at our warning in that chamber. They were not laughing now. I carried Grace Whitfield's name with me into every briefing that followed, a small private weight I did not share with anyone, not even Pierce. Not even Adam, who carried his own version of that same weight in the hollow look that never fully left his eyes again. I understood, watching the Council's panicked communications scroll across Clark's screens, that we had crossed a line that no warning, no podium, no chamber full of laughing delegates could ever uncross. The first door had been kicked in. There was no walking back out of it now, for any of us. And somewhere behind that door, in 11 different languages, the Council was finally starting to ask the only question that mattered. What else had the loud species been building, quietly, in the dark, while everyone assumed they were still just learning to use their words? 3 weeks after the convoy engagement, a Council battle group of 14 ships dropped out of transit at the edge of the Sol Corridor, and Clark's intelligence feed lit up with a single line that turned the entire hangar silent in the space of a heartbeat. They are not here to negotiate. Pierce called every pilot to the flight deck before the alert had finished sounding through the halls. 14 ships against our 3, a number that should have ended any conversation about engagement before it started, except that the Void Fleet had never planned to win battles through matched numbers. We had planned to win them through the one thing the Council still did not understand about us. Even after losing an entire squadron to a force they had not seen coming, they still did not know what else was hiding in the dark. I stood on the flight deck with Pierce as the battle group's formation scrolled across the main display, and for the first time since the hangar had pulled me out of my bed in the middle of the night, I watched him hesitate, just slightly, just long enough for me to notice it. 14 ships is too many for 3 to handle clean, he said, mostly to himself. We need a way to make them doubt their own numbers before we ever fire a shot. It was Henry Voss who found the answer, 2 hours before the battle group reached firing range, pulling Pierce aside with a tablet full of readings that meant nothing to me, and clearly meant everything to her. The absorption hulls, she explained, did more than hide a single ship from a single sweep. Layered correctly, flown in close enough formation, 3 ships could be made to register, briefly, as a much larger contact, a sensor ghost suggesting a fleet many times our actual size. It won't hold past the first exchange of fire, she warned. The moment we engage, they'll see exactly what we are. But for the first few minutes, before anyone fires anything, we can make 14 ships hesitate against what looks like 40. Pierce gave the order within the hour. The battle group entered the edge of Sol space expecting an empty system, the same empty system their treaty inspectors had certified clean for 3 years running, and instead found a sensor return that suggested a force large enough to make even a 14-ship battle group pause at the threshold, recalculating an engagement they had been certain, until that exact moment, was already won before it began. I listened on the open channel as their commander hesitated, ordering a slower approach, a more cautious formation, exactly the kind of doubt Voss had promised us. It bought time. It did not buy a victory on its own. Pierce's voice came through every ship's comm, steady, even, carrying none of the hesitation I had seen on his face 2 hours earlier. We use the doubt. We do not waste it standing still. What followed was not the clean, surgical strike of the convoy engagement. 14 ships against 3, even with every advantage Voss's hulls and Clark's intelligence could provide, meant a battle stretched thin across more than an hour, our ships weaving through gaps in the battle group's formation, striking and retreating, disabling what we could, and absorbing damage we could not avoid. Adam Foley's voice filled the comm channel through most of it, calling targets, calling warnings. The steady, focused calm I remembered from the convoy engagement carrying him through exchange after exchange without a single mistake. It was the 31st minute that changed everything. Pierce's ship took a direct hit across its command section, the kind of strike that should not have been possible against an absorption hull moving at full evasive speed, and for nearly 2 full minutes, no order came through the fleet channel at all. Adam's ship moved to cover the gap on instinct, placing itself between Pierce's damaged vessel and 3 Council cruisers converging to finish what their lucky strike had started. I sat in the observation seat of the 3rd ship, watching the display, understanding with a cold, sinking clarity that someone needed to give an order, and that for those 2 silent minutes, with Pierce unresponsive and no clear chain of command established for exactly this gap, that order had nowhere else to come from but me. Fall back to Pierce's position, I said into the open channel, my voice steadier than I felt. All ships converge. Protect the command vessel. Adam, you are not holding that gap alone. Copy, Adam's voice came back, tight but certain, already moving before I had finished the sentence. The 3 cruisers bearing down on Pierce's ship split their fire as our remaining vessels converged, exactly as I had ordered, and for a handful of seconds, the gap held. Then one of the cruisers, the one nearest Adam's ship, fired a final spread before our weapons disabled its drive, a desperate, unaimed burst that should not have found anything in the chaos of that converging formation. It found Adam's ship instead. I will not describe what that strike did to the hull, or to the people inside it, in any detail beyond what matters. I will only say that Adam Foley held that gap exactly as long as it needed holding, and that Pierce's command vessel, damaged and silent, made it through those final minutes intact, because a 20-year-old weapons officer had decided, without being ordered to, that the gap was his to close. The remaining Council ships broke off shortly after, their commander recognizing, finally, that whatever force had ambushed Squadron 7-9 3 weeks earlier was not a single lucky strike but a standing threat his battle group had no clear way to overcome. They retreated in a formation that looked less like an organized withdrawal and more like a fleet that had stopped believing in its own numbers partway through the fight. We had won. I understood that, technically, mathematically, in every measure that mattered to a war room back on Earth. I did not feel like someone who had won anything, sitting in the wreckage-strewn quiet that followed, holding the weight of an order I had given, because nobody else had been able to give it in time. Pierce recovered, slowly, over the following days, and the first thing he did once he could stand on his own was find me in the mess hall and sit across from me without saying anything for a long while, the way Grace once had on the hangar's upper platform. "You gave the right order," he said finally. "It still cost Adam everything. Every order in this war cost someone everything, eventually." He looked down at his hands, scarred now in ways they had not been before the battle. The difference between a good commander and a bad one is not whether people die under their orders. It's whether the order was the right one anyway, knowing that cost going in. You knew it. You gave it anyway. That's the job now, Caleb, whether you wanted it or not. I did not feel comforted by that. I do not think he meant it to comfort me. I think he meant it as a door closing behind a version of myself that no longer existed, the same way the Chamber's laughter had closed a door 3 months earlier. Except this door had Adam Foley's name written on the other side of it, and I would carry that name the same way I carried Grace Whitfield's, quiet and private, into every decision that came after. Not every species reached the same conclusion. Threll Vassarin's voice, when Clark's intercepts caught it, carried none of Dorham's uncertainty, only a hardened fury that promised escalation rather than compromise, a commitment to make an example of Earth severe enough to erase whatever doubt our victories had planted in the rest of the Chamber. He did not wait long to act on that promise. 8 days after Senar Ives' session, 3 independent strike groups, none of them flying under official council colors but every one of them traced back through Clark's intercepts to funding, and weapons routed through Vassarin's own cluster, struck a small mining outpost on the edge of human-controlled space. A settlement of less than 400 people that had nothing to do with the Void Fleet, and everything to do with sending a message that no corner of human territory could be considered safe anymore. Pierce did not hesitate this time. We had 3 ships when Squadron 7-9 attacked the convoy. We had 11 by the time Vassarin's strike groups reached that outpost, the hangar's secret production lines finally able to keep pace with a war that no longer needed to hide itself in shadow, and Pierce committed 9 of them to the outpost's defense within an hour of Clark's warning reaching the flight deck. I did not fly that engagement. Pierce kept me grounded at the command post, a decision I argued against and lost, and I spent the 4 hours of that battle listening to the comm traffic instead of living inside it, which I came to understand was its own particular kind of difficult, hearing every strike and every near miss without the ability to do anything but listen. The strike groups were not council military, not trained or disciplined the way Squadron 7-9 had been. They were closer to mercenaries, fast and aggressive but undisciplined under real pressure. And our pilots, 11 ships now flying with 3 weeks of real combat experience behind them instead of simulation drills alone, broke their formation within the first 20 minutes. By the time it ended, 2 of the 3 strike groups had been disabled and captured, the 3rd scattered and fled, and the outpost's 400 residents walked away from an attack meant to terrorize them having lost exactly nobody. It was not a clean victory. Nothing in this war had been clean since the moment Grace Whitfield put her ship between Sinclair's convoy and Osrin Kett's final desperate strike. But it was a victory that cost us no names this time, and I learned, standing at that command post listening to Pierce's voice confirm every pilot's safe return, that a victory without a name attached to its cost felt almost unfamiliar now, a relief I did not entirely know how to hold. Vassarin's response to the outpost's failed destruction was not retreat. Clark's intercepts caught him in a closed session 2 days later, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence but not of its conviction, arguing for a full council mobilization against Earth, a war footing beyond anything the blockade or the enforcement squadrons had represented. He did not get the votes he needed, Senar Ives' growing caution, and a handful of smaller clusters now quietly aligned with whatever back-channel understanding Cale Durham was building with Laura Bennett, held the chamber from full mobilization by a margin Clark described as uncomfortably thin. "Thin is still a margin," Pierce said, when I relayed the report to him. "Thin means there's still a version of this that doesn't end with both sides burning everything down to make a point. I'll take thin over nothing." The political fallout reached us before the physical wounds had finished healing. Laura Bennett's back-channel contact, maintained in careful secrecy through the entire campaign, finally produced something neither of us had expected this early. Cale Durham, the delegate who had not laughed in that first chamber session, who had watched me with an expression I had not understood at the time, requested a private meeting through routes that bypassed the full council entirely. "He says some of the smaller clusters are reconsidering their position," Laura told me, relaying the message over a secure line. "Not because they respect us now, because they're realizing the council's strength was always borrowed from the assumption that nobody would ever fight back hard enough to make the cost visible. You made the cost visible, Caleb. Some of them are asking themselves whether they want to keep paying it on the council's behalf." Not every species reached the same conclusion. Threll Vassarin's voice, when Clark's intercepts caught it, carried none of Durham's uncertainty, only a hardened fury that promised escalation rather than compromise, a commitment to make an example of Earth severe enough to erase whatever doubt our victories had planted in the rest of the chamber. The council, I understood now, was no longer one voice laughing in unison. It was 11 different voices, fracturing along lines none of us could fully predict, some bending toward fear of us, others toward a fury that would not bend at all. Senar Ive, in a session Clark's people recorded and forwarded to Earth within hours, used my name for the first time, not the title of translator, not the dismissive noted and unconvincing of that first session, but my actual name, spoken into a chamber that had stopped laughing entirely. "The human known as Caleb Sterling appears to be coordinating fleet command in addition to diplomatic functions," she said, her voice carrying none of the contempt it had carried 3 months earlier, replaced now with something colder and far more careful. "This council must reconsider every assumption it has made about this species' capabilities, and reconsider it without delay, before those assumptions cost us more than they already have." I listened to that recording 3 times before I understood what it actually meant. The council no longer saw me as the translator who delivered a warning they laughed at. They saw me as someone worth being afraid of. I was not certain, listening to Senar Ive's careful, frightened voice, whether that was a victory or simply a different shape of the same cost that had already taken Grace Whitfield and Adam Foley from me, one battle at a time, one name at a time, carried forward into whatever room came next. The message reached the hangar at 4 in the morning, and I was awake to receive it before the second alert had finished sounding, because sleep had stopped coming easily months ago, and I had learned not to fight the hours it refused to fill. Clark's voice carried none of her usual flat calm. Threll Vassarin had moved without council authorization, gathering every ship loyal to his cluster and a handful of mercenary groups still willing to take his coin, and he was burning a direct course toward Earth itself, not an outpost, not a convoy, the planet, with every weapon his fleet could carry. 31 ships, our entire Void fleet numbered 19, scattered across 3 different defensive postings, none of which had been built to consolidate in time. Pierce called every commander to the flight deck within minutes, and I watched him do the math on the display the same way he had done it before the convoy engagement, except this time there was no clean answer hiding behind a clever trick of the hulls. 31 ships against whatever fraction of 19 we could gather before Vassarin's fleet reached firing range was not a battle we could win through ambush or absorption hulls or careful patience. "We're not going to stop him with what we have in the air," Pierce said, flat and certain, no hesitation left in his voice after months of carrying this war on his shoulders. "We're going to slow him down. Every minute we buy is a minute Earth's ground defenses have to prepare, and a minute for whatever Laura Bennett can pull out of that chamber before this turns into something none of us walk away from." I asked him what my role was in that plan. He looked at me for a long moment, the same look he had given me in the hangar 3 months earlier, the one that had asked whether I wanted to be part of what came next. "Your role is the chamber," he said. "Bennett's flight leaves in 20 minutes. Vassarin moved without council authorization. That means technically he's not acting as the council's voice anymore. He's acting alone. If you can get Senar Ive and Durham's coalition to say that out loud, in session, on the record, before his fleet reaches Earth, you take away the one thing he needs more than ships." "What's that?" "Legitimacy," Pierce said. "Strip that away in front of the whole galaxy, and even his own crews start asking why they're dying for a man the council itself has disowned." I flew to the chamber with Laura Bennett in a transport that felt smaller and more fragile than any ship I had sat inside in months. No absorption hull, no weapons, nothing but the two of us and whatever words we could carry into a room that had laughed at our last attempt to matter inside it. The session Senar Ive called on Laura's emergency request filled the chamber faster than any I had attended before, delegates arriving in states of undress and confusion that told me Vassarin's unauthorized fleet movement had caught the rest of the council as off guard as it had caught us. I stood at the same podium I had stood at 3 months earlier, my hands flat on the same cold rail, and this time, nobody laughed before I had said a single word. Ambassador Vassarin has moved a fleet of 31 ships toward Earth without council authorization, I said, my voice carrying through the chamber without need of amplification, the silence around me doing more work than volume ever could. He acts alone. Every casualty his fleet causes from this point forward is his alone to answer for, not this council's, unless this council chooses, right now, to claim his actions as its own. Senar Ive's eyes moved across the chamber before she spoke, reading the room the way I had once watched her read it for laughter, except now she was reading it for something closer to fear. The council did not authorize Ambassador Vassarin's fleet movement, she said, each word measured, deliberate, a line being drawn in front of the entire assembly. His actions are condemned as the unilateral aggression of his cluster alone. It was not a victory. It was a sentence, spoken into a chamber full of beings still deciding whether to believe it mattered, and somewhere beyond the walls of that room, Vassarin's fleet continued its burn toward Earth regardless of what any council session declared about its legitimacy. Cale Durham rose from his seat, the first time I had seen him speak in open session rather than through the careful back channels he and Laura Bennett had maintained for months. I move that this council authorize a joint defensive action, he said. Earth's fleet cannot hold against 31 ships alone. If we mean what we just declared, we prove it with more than words. The vote that followed took 11 minutes, the longest 11 minutes of my life. 11 minutes during which Vassarin's fleet continued burning toward a planet I had grown up on, carrying inside it every name I had ever known, every name I had lost in the months since this war began. The vote passed, narrowly. 6 clusters in favor, 4 opposed, 1 abstaining, in a silence that told its own story about which side that delegation hoped would win, without committing to help them do it. Combined council ships, 18 vessels from clusters that had spent 3 months watching Earth bleed and finally deciding which side of the coming history they wanted to stand on, joined what remained of the Void Fleet at the edge of Sol space 4 hours before Vassarin's fleet arrived. It was not enough ships to guarantee victory. It was enough to turn the math from impossible into merely terrible, and in a war that had taught me terrible odds were sometimes the only odds available, I had learned to be grateful for terrible instead of impossible. I watched the final battle from the chamber itself, through a feed Clark routed to every delegate's station, because Senar Ive had insisted the council witness directly what their decision had purchased, rather than receive it secondhand through a report written days later. Vassarin's fleet met the combined defense at the edge of Sol space, and I will not pretend the battle that followed looked anything like the precise, surgical engagement against Squadron 7-9 months earlier. It was chaos, raw and immediate, 31 ships against 37. Pierce's voice steady across every channel even as ships on both sides flared and went dark across the display. Names I knew and names I would never learn scattered across a battle that decided, in the space of 2 brutal hours, what kind of galaxy would exist on the other side of it. Noah Sinclair flew a defense transport in that battle, having refused, 3 times, every order to stay grounded, and I watched his ship hold a line of civilian evacuation routes open against Vassarin's flanking attempt, with the same steady hands that had once powered down a convoy as bait, trusting people he had never met to protect what he could not protect alone. Henry Voss's absorption hulls, layered now across all 19 Void Fleet ships, and 3 of the Council's own vessels retrofitted in a desperate 48 hours before the battle, bought the kind of confusion in Vassarin's formation that turned his numerical advantage into chaos his own commanders could not coordinate fast enough to exploit. Megan Clark ran the battle's intelligence picture from a station beside me in the chamber, feeding targeting data to Pierce's fleet through a relay she had built in secret months earlier, for exactly this kind of crisis. Her voice the only steady thing in a room otherwise gone quiet with held breath. Twice she caught Vassarin's commanders shifting formation before the move had fully begun, calling the warning to Pierce's channel half a second before it would have mattered too late. The difference, in a battle measured in heartbeats, between a disabled ship and a destroyed one. Sinclair's transport took fire twice along the evacuation corridor, the second strike close enough to knock out half his shielding, and for nearly a full minute, watching his ship's signal flicker on the display. I understood exactly what Pierce must have felt watching Grace's ship spin out of formation months earlier. The particular helplessness of caring about someone you cannot reach from where you are standing. His signal steadied. He held the corridor anyway. The same stubborn refusal to abandon a post that had carried him through every mission since the very first convoy. And 3 transport ships full of evacuated civilians passed safely through the gap he refused to close. It was Pierce's ship that found Vassarin's flagship in the final 20 minutes. A strike Pierce delivered himself, disabling rather than destroying. The same discipline he had drilled into every pilot since the very first night I walked into that hangar. Even now, even against the man who had ordered Earth's destruction without a single moment's hesitation about the lives that order would cost. Vassarin's fleet broke within minutes of his flagship going dark, scattered and fleeing in directions that no longer answered to any single command. And the chamber around me erupted into a noise I had never heard a council session make before. Not laughter this time, something closer to the particular silence 11 different species share when they have just watched history change shape in front of them and have not yet decided how to speak about it. Senar Ive did not call for order right away. She let the silence sit, the way I once watched her let laughter sit, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the contempt from that first session 3 months earlier. Earth has demonstrated, beyond any further argument this chamber can offer, that it is not a client species to be measured and managed, she said. This council will open formal proceedings to grant Earth a permanent seat among its members, with full voice and full vote, effective immediately. I should have felt triumph standing there, listening to the sentence I had wanted to hear since the day I first stood at that podium, and read out a warning nobody believed. I felt instead the particular hollow weight of a victory paid for in names I would carry for the rest of my life. Grace Whitfield's hands steady on the controls until the very last second they were still hers to hold. Adam Foley closing a gap nobody had ordered him to close. And however many names I had never learned, scattered now across the wreckage of a battle fought to buy a sentence that should never have needed buying in the first place. Laura Bennett found me afterward, in the quiet hallway outside the chamber. And she did not offer congratulations, because she understood, the same way I did, that congratulations was the wrong word for what this cost had purchased. You did this, she said instead. We did this, I corrected her. All of us. The ones who are here to hear it, and the ones who aren't. She nodded, and for a moment neither of us said anything else, standing in a hallway built from 11 different worlds' architecture, sharing nothing but a wall, listening to the distant sound of a chamber finally learning to speak about Earth in a different language than the one it had used 3 months earlier. Pierce found us both an hour later, his uniform still marked with the battle, and he did not say much either, only that the council had requested Earth's first official seated delegate begin attending sessions within the week, and that Laura Bennett's office had already submitted my name for the role, an honor I had not asked for and was not certain, standing there, that I wanted. You don't have to decide tonight, Pierce told me, reading the hesitation on my face, the way he had always read everything else about me since that first night in the hangar. But for what it's worth, I think Grace would have told you to take it. She always said the next time someone tried to make us small, she wanted to be the reason it didn't work. Seems to me that work isn't finished just because the shooting stopped. I thought about that for a long while, standing in that hallway. The weight of every name I carried settled somewhere behind my ribs where it had lived since the convoy engagement, never lighter, never fully unbearable, simply present, the way grief learns to live alongside a person rather than ever fully leaving them. I took the seat. Before my first official session as Earth's delegate, I asked for 1 day alone, and Brackett, who had never once denied me anything since that first walk back from the chamber 3 months earlier, granted it without asking why. I took a transport up past the orbital defense line, the same line Vassarin's fleet had tried to break, and looked down at Earth the way I had looked at it from the diplomatic shuttle on the night this entire war began, blue and small and turning slowly beneath me. It did not look unprotected anymore. I could see the shapes of patrol craft moving along the edge of the atmosphere, some of them Void Fleet black, some of them bearing the markings of council clusters who had finally chosen a side worth choosing, a thin defensive line that had not existed the last time I watched this exact view from this exact angle. I found Henry Voss at the hangar before I returned to the chamber, standing alone beside the ship that had carried Pierce's flag through the final battle, running one hand along plating that still bore the scars of Vassarin's last strike. She did not look up right away when I approached. They'll want me to build bigger ships now, she said. Proper ones. Ones with the council's blessing stamped on every hull plate. Inspected twice a year same as before. Except this time we get to set the terms of the inspection instead of just enduring it. Is that a bad thing? No. She finally looked at me, and for the first time since I had met her in that hangar, I saw something close to tired relief in her expression, rather than the fierce, guarded pride she usually carried. It just means the part of this job that needed to stay secret is finished. I built these ships so nobody would ever laugh at a warning again. Feels strange, knowing the next ones I build, everybody gets to watch. I left her there, working alone in a hangar that no longer needed to hide what it held, and I carried that image with me back into the chamber. A door that had once been kicked in standing open now in the daylight. Nothing left behind it that needed darkness to survive. 3 months after the council laughed at our final warning, I stood again at a podium in that same chamber, not as a translator reading words written for me by someone else, but as Earth's first seated delegate, speaking words that were entirely my own, in a room that had finally learned to listen before it decided whether something deserved an answer. I did not deliver a warning that day. I delivered something closer to an accounting, the names of every person the Void Fleet had lost in 3 months of a war that should never have needed fighting, spoken slowly, one at a time, into a chamber that owed each of them a debt no seat at any table could ever fully repay. Grace Whitfield, Adam Foley, and the others, the ones whose names I had only learned after they were already gone, read into a record that would outlast every delegate currently seated in that room, a record that would not let the cost of that first laughter be forgotten by anyone who came looking for it afterward. The council did not laugh this time. They listened, and somewhere in that listening, in the particular silence 11 worlds shared while I spoke names none of them had ever met, I understood that the war had not ended with humanity winning a seat at their table. It had ended with the table itself finally learning what it had cost to build.